1935, and a thin mist still clings to the shingle flats of Denge, on the Romney Marsh in Kent. A young listener, headphones pressed tight against his ears, sits in a concrete bowl wide enough to swallow a house. Before him, curving 30 feet into the gray sky, stands a vast parabolic wall of poured concrete, its surface polished smooth by years of wind and salt spray. He does not look up. He listens. Somewhere out over the channel, a flight of biplane bombers drones towards the coast on a routine exercise, and his task is to hear them minutes before any human ear, unaided, ever could. He shifts the small trumpet-shaped collector mounted on an iron arm in front of the dish, sweeping it left, then right, chasing the faintest thread of engine noise gathered and focused by tons of curved concrete behind him. Then there, a low and steady hum, no louder than a fly trapped against a window pane, yet unmistakably mechanical. He calls out a bearing. Somewhere behind him, a telephone line carries that single word, a compass direction, to a plotting room, where it becomes a mark on a map, and, if all goes well, the first link in a chain that ends with fighters scrambling into the sky. This is not radar. There is no radar yet, not for another 3 years. This is something stranger and, in its own way, more remarkable. A machine built not to see the enemy, but to hear him, designed to give Britain's defenders a precious few minutes of warning using nothing more sophisticated than shaped concrete, sound waves, and the patient, trained ear of a single operator. Long before any radio mast could trace a bomber's path across a screen, these vast listening structures, scattered along England's southern and eastern coasts, represented the country's only systematic answer to a question that had haunted its planners since the previous war. How do you defend a nation against an enemy that arrives from the sky faster than any warning can travel? What follows is the story of that answer, a network of concrete ears that, for a brief and largely forgotten decade, stood as Britain's first line of air defense, and whose principles, if not their technology, would outlive them by generations. The story begins not with the Luftwaffe, which did not yet exist under that name, but with its predecessor. Between 1915 and 1918, German Zeppelins and then, more devastatingly, Gotha bombers had carried out a sustained campaign against London and other British towns, killing an estimated 1,400 people and injuring several thousand more in raids that, for the first time in history, brought the experience of aerial bombardment directly into ordinary streets and homes. The psychological shock far outweighed the material damage. Britain, an island that had relied for centuries on the Royal Navy to keep war at arm's length, discovered that the sea no longer offered any protection at all. Worse, the existing defenses proved almost useless. Anti-aircraft guns of the period rarely hit anything. Fighters scrambled from grass airfields often climbed too slowly to intercept bombers that had already dropped their loads and turned for home. And searchlights, however powerful, could only find an aircraft that observers already knew, roughly, where to look for. The fundamental problem was warning time. A formation of bombers crossing the Kent coast at a typical cruising speed could reach the outskirts of London in well under half an hour. Spotting them by eye required clear weather and daylight. Spotting them by ear, at any useful distance, required hearing that no ordinary person possessed. By the early 1920s, with the immediate threat receded, the problem might easily have been forgotten. It was not. Air Ministry planners examining the lessons of the Gotha raids concluded that future bombers would only grow faster, fly higher, and carry more destructive loads, while the warning time available to defenders would shrink correspondingly. The politician, Stanley Baldwin, would later crystallize the anxiety in a notorious phrase to the House of Commons in 1932, telling members that the bomber would always get through. Whatever defenses existed, he argued, no city could ever be made entirely safe from the air. The only way to mitigate that grim arithmetic was to claw back time wherever possible, and in the absence of any technology capable of detecting aircraft by radio, sound remained the only available medium. By 1933, the threat had a new and specific shape. Germany's rearmament under the Nazi government and the open declaration of the Luftwaffe as an independent air force in 1935 transformed an abstract planning exercise into an urgent operational requirement. Britain needed a means of detecting incoming aircraft at the greatest possible range, using whatever science could offer in the years before anyone had proved that radio waves might do the job instead. The man tasked with solving this problem was Dr. William Sansom Tucker, a physicist who had spent the First World War developing sound-ranging techniques for locating enemy artillery, work that involved analyzing the precise arrival time of a gun's report at several separated microphones to calculate its position. Tucker reasoned that the same underlying principle, applied differently, might allow operators to detect and track approaching aircraft long before they came into view. Working initially from the Air Defense Experimental Establishment, which moved between sites at Biggin Hill, Hawking, and eventually the flat, sparsely populated expanse of Romney Marsh in Kent, Tucker and his small team spent the latter half of the 1920s refining a deceptively simple idea: build a concrete dish large enough and precisely curved enough to gather faint sound waves from miles away and focus them onto a single point, much as a magnifying glass concentrates sunlight onto a fixed spot. The earliest prototypes, completed around 1928, were modest concrete discs, some 4.5 meters, 15 feet across, essentially oversized versions of the portable acoustic horns already used by some anti-aircraft batteries. A second generation, roughly 6 meters, 20 feet in diameter, followed in 1930, curved with mathematical precision so that sound arriving from a particular direction converged on a small collector mounted on an adjustable arm. The most ambitious structure of all, completed the same year at Denge, abandoned the dish shape altogether in favor of an extraordinary 70-meter, 230-foot, curved concrete wall, embedded with a series of microphones at intervals along its length, an early attempt to build something closer to a listening array than a single ear, capable of triangulating bearings with greater precision than any individual mirror could achieve alone. The physics, though impressive in execution, was simple enough to explain without equations. Imagine cupping a hand behind your ear to gather more sound. The concrete mirrors did the same thing, but on a scale roughly equivalent to a house, built from a material that would neither flex nor absorb the very sound waves it was designed to capture. An operator, headphones connected to a small trumpet-shaped collector positioned at the mirror's focal point, could rotate that collector through a narrow arc, listening for the point at which an aircraft's engine note grew loudest and clearest, rather like tuning an old wireless set by ear until a faint station resolves out of static. Under good conditions, with calm air and a trained operator, the larger mirrors were credited with detecting aircraft at ranges of perhaps 24 to 32 kilometers, 15 to 20 miles, translating into roughly 15 minutes of warning against the bombers of the period, enough, in theory, for fighters to be scrambled and to climb to an intercepting altitude before the enemy arrived. Construction fell mostly to the Royal Engineers, working with civilian contractors, pouring tons of concrete directly onto the shingle of the marsh, a location chosen specifically for its isolation from the background noise of towns, railways, and main roads, all of which could drown out the faint signal the mirrors were built to capture. In total, perhaps half a dozen substantial mirrors were completed in Kent, with smaller or experimental examples attempted elsewhere along the English coast, including sites in Yorkshire and the northeast. The precise number and the fate of several smaller prototypes remains genuinely unclear, since wartime secrecy and the rapid abandonment of the program left an incomplete paper trail that historians have only partially reconstructed. Exact production figures for the program remain difficult to pin down, and any total offered here should be treated as an estimate rather than a settled fact. Unlike a mass-produced weapon, each mirror was a bespoke piece of civil engineering, poured on site over weeks rather than assembled on a production line, which means there was never a single official tally of how many were built, only a scattered set of regional totals recorded by different commands at different times. Surviving Air Ministry papers and the physical remains themselves suggest somewhere between 5 and 10 substantial mirrors across the Kent coast alone, with a smaller number of trial structures elsewhere whose fate in several cases is simply unrecorded. Some may have been demolished for hardcore during later building works, others left to crumble quietly into the landscape once funding ceased. What the surviving record makes clear is that the mirrors saw far more use as research instruments than as genuine operational early warning weapons. Through the early 1930s, they were repeatedly tested against the RAF's own aircraft during the annual air defense exercises, mock raids staged specifically to probe Britain's home defenses, with operators logging detection ranges, bearing accuracy and the maddening effect of wind direction, which could distort a bearing by several degrees or drown a faint engine note entirely beneath the roar of the sea. Surviving accounts describe operators sitting for hours in near silence, straining against headphones for a sound indistinguishable at first from wind across the shingle or a distant trawler's engine, before gradually learning to isolate the particular low throb of an aero engine from everything else competing for their attention. Documented successes are harder to pin down than the scale of the structures might suggest. No interception during an actual wartime raid has ever been conclusively credited to a sound mirror warning, and by the time war broke out in September 1939, the system that would actually defend Britain's skies was radar, not acoustics. A handful of mirrors did remain staffed into the early war years, chiefly as a low-cost backup in case radar coverage failed, or to plug gaps at very low altitude where early radar struggled, but their role by then was marginal rather than central, and the historical record on exactly when each installation was finally abandoned remains patchy at best. If you are enjoying this one, a quick subscribe genuinely helps the channel keep telling these stories. Now, back to Denge, and to the rivals Britain's listening machines never quite had to face in earnest. Britain was not alone in pursuing acoustic detection during these years, though no other nation built quite so permanent or monumental a version of the idea. Germany developed the Ringtrichterichtungshörer, literally a ringhorn direction listener, a portable device built around paired horn-shaped collectors mounted on a frame that an operator could swivel by hand, used by both the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine for short-range acoustic detection of aircraft, and in naval contexts for tracking surface vessels. Smaller and far more mobile than Tucker's concrete mirrors, the German device traded maximum range for flexibility, reflecting a different doctrinal emphasis on point defense around specific targets rather than a fixed coastal early warning chain. Imperial Japan pursued perhaps the most visually striking equivalent, building large multi-horn acoustic locators, sometimes nicknamed war tubas in later popular accounts, that clustered 4 or 5 enormous horns together to improve directional accuracy, deployed around Tokyo and other major cities into the opening years of the Second World War. Like the British mirrors, these structures were ultimately defeated by the same fundamental limitation. Sound travels too slowly, and aircraft, by the late 1930s, had simply become too fast for any acoustic system to provide adequate warning once distances shrank and engine noise grew quieter relative to airframe speed. The United States, meanwhile, experimented with acoustic locators chiefly in a coastal artillery and harbor defense context rather than as a national air raid warning network, reflecting both its geographic distance from any immediate aerial threat and a research establishment that, by the early 1930s, was already beginning to explore radio-based alternatives. What distinguished the British program was not necessarily superior accuracy, since on a clear day all of these systems performed comparably and all suffered the same problems in wind or rain, but its organizational ambition. Tucker's mirrors fed bearings not to a single battery commander, but, in principle, to a wider reporting and plotting structure, an attempt to create something resembling a coordinated, networked early warning chain rather than a collection of isolated listening posts. That underlying concept, of dispersed sensors reporting continuously to a central plotting room, where information could be filtered and turned into orders, proved far more durable than the acoustic technology itself. When radar replaced sound as the detection method of choice, it inherited precisely this organizational architecture, refined into what would become known as the Dowding system, the command and control network credited with Britain's success during the Battle of Britain in 1940. Assessed purely as weapons of war, the sound mirrors must be judged a technological dead end, and an unusually short-lived one at that. On February 26, 1935, a modest experiment near Daventry demonstrated that aircraft could be detected by reflecting radio waves rather than listening for engine noise, work that within months convinced the Air Ministry to redirect its resources decisively towards what would become known as radar. By 1936, the writing was already on the wall for acoustic detection. By 1937 and 1938, as the first chain-home radar stations rose along the same stretches of coast the mirrors had occupied, funding for further acoustic research had effectively ceased. Measured by aircraft detected, lives saved or raids disrupted, the material contribution of the sound mirrors to Britain's eventual victory in the air was, on the available evidence, negligible. And yet to dismiss the program as a curious failure would be to miss its real significance. The mirrors represented Britain's first serious, sustained attempt to build a systematic, networked early warning capability against air attack, years before any comparable radio technology existed to make the task feasible. They proved, in practice rather than theory, that detection at range, however imperfect, translated directly into additional minutes for fighters to scramble and climb, validating the entire strategic logic that radar would later exploit far more effectively. The operators, plotting rooms, and reporting procedures developed around the mirrors did not vanish with the technology. They were carried forward, adapted, and ultimately absorbed into the radar-based system that won the Battle of Britain. Several of the structures survive today, preserved as scheduled monuments rather than active defenses. The cluster at Denge, near Greatstone-on-Sea on the Romney Marsh, now sits within a nature reserve managed in part for its dragonfly population, the great concrete dishes rising incongruously from the shingle alongside Dungeness's lighthouses and its nuclear power station. Further examples survive at Hythe, Sunderland, Kilnsea, and Boulder, in varying states of repair, sometimes known locally as the listening ears. None of them ever heard a genuine enemy raid approach with the clarity their designers had hoped for. All of them remain nonetheless as concrete evidence of an idea that arrived just slightly before its time. Return, for a moment, to that morning on the Romney Marsh, to the operator with his headphones and his small trumpet-shaped collector, straining to isolate one faint engine note from the wind and the sea. He never knew in 1935 that within 5 years the entire method by which Britain detected aircraft would be rendered obsolete, replaced by an invisible web of radio waves bouncing silently off aluminium skins at the speed of light rather than the speed of sound. He could not have known that the vast concrete ear curving above him, built at such expense and with such care, would never once provide the decisive warning of an actual German raid, and yet none of that diminishes what he and Tucker's small team of engineers had achieved. What they built was not, in the end, a weapon. It detected nothing that radar would not detect more reliably within a few short years, and it can claim no confirmed interception, no documented raid disrupted by its warning. What it built instead was an idea, the idea that an island nation, faced with an enemy that could approach from any direction at speeds no human eye could match, might still claw back precious minutes through sheer ingenuity, by listening harder and more systematically than anyone had thought to listen before. That idea, encoded first in poured concrete and trumpet-shaped collectors, would be inherited wholesale by the radar stations that replaced them. The same dispersed sensors, the same telephone lines to a central plotting room, the same operators translating a faint signal into a single, urgent bearing. Britain built giant ears because it could not yet build eyes. It built them on an empty, wind-swept marsh, out of a material that would outlast the men who poured it, in the hope of buying a few extra minutes against an enemy whose aircraft every year grew a little faster and a little harder to hear in time. The mirrors did not win the Battle of Britain. They did not, so far as any surviving record shows, save a single life directly. But they proved that the underlying problem could be solved, that warning time could be manufactured rather than simply hoped for, and in doing so they handed the engineers who built Chainhome not just a precedent but a working blueprint for how detection, reporting, and command might be woven together into a single system. Stand today on the shingle at Denge, beside the great curved wall that once strained to hear bombers approaching from across the channel, and the silence is almost total. No aircraft, no operators, no urgent bearings called down a telephone line. Just wind and gulls and an enormous concrete ear still turned patiently towards a horizon it will never need to listen to again. It was built to hear the future coming. In the end, it was radar, not sound, that saw it arrive first. But somewhere in that gap between what the mirrors achieved and